Well, right, because it's that technocratic, bloodless liberal centrism that thinks that pure reason and technocracy is the be-all, end-all, and that anything that interferes with that is the enemy, as if the system and structure itself isn't perpetuating violence and creating the actual harm that is what is being responded to by the people that are, actually people with flesh and blood and have emotions, right? And there is, of course, like a long tradition, though, going back, and we've talked in this podcast before, but going back to Plato about rule by the many, and Aristotle breaks this down into good and bad forms of government, right? For whether it's one, few, or many, there are good and bad forms of it. For Plato, by its very nature, rule by the many was kind of anarchy or the bad form, whereas Aristotle thought that a polity could have a healthy version as opposed to the anarchic one, where it's just kind of all the inflamed passions and self-interest of the mob aggregating, right? Rather than the many working together towards the common good. And this, in Rousseau, we see is the difference between what he would call the will of all versus the general will. Whereas the will of all is kind of an aggregation of all those individual self-interests, and the general will is actually the common good. So like the example I like to give is, if you simply aggregate self-interest, no one wants to pay taxes, so taxes won't be collected. Okay, and then nobody gets anything, and everybody suffers. But if you actually, what Rousseau says, if you will for yourself that which is truly in your interest, you're going to have your will align with the common good, and so everyone wants to pay taxes, and then you'll have like an actual functioning system. So like democracy can be something that is this individualistic, anarchic aggregation of passionate self-interest in a mobocracy, or it can be something more egalitarian and something that like many people from Rousseau on would try to say is actually democracy, when you actually think about the common good and your participation in it. But that is, again, naturally going to be an anti-elitist stance, right? To topple those oligarchs, plutocrats that are not serving the common good. And so that's going to look like a threat to them. And so the question is, can that populist movement actually take the power, and then when it's governing, not be co-opted by a demagogue like Trump, right? And Lincoln in Lyceum Address warns of this, that the mob who doesn't adhere to the law, vigilante justice, and all this stuff will give rise to this tyrant. And so that's a real theme in political theory and in history, but it need not be that. Okay.
No, and I would say that it's like when you're looking at considering a society which is ripe for kind of populist upsurge. It's usually a society in which democracy has been sort of quietly strangled in some way or another, in which there are no real choices on offer, and a society that is suffering some like serious economic problems. And so that can go, I would say, one of two ways. You can have a sort of like universalist populism, which is kind of anti-racist, which is sort of like at least nominally pluralistic, and you can have one which is conservative, which is sort of like a proto-fascist, you might say, which says that
exclusionary.
Yeah,
right,
exactly. Yeah. And the I think that the fundamental political mistake that is being made, in Europe and the Democratic Party to a lesser extent, is to, wield the rhetoric of democracy against all kinds of populism writ large, and the only type of populism that works against really is the left, because the left egalitarian populism is more reasonable and weaker than the right-wing version. And what you end up doing, and we've seen this in Europe, is that the authoritarian elitists, the Eurocrats, the polit-Euro of the Eurozone, they crushed the Social Democrats, these sort of like earnest, egalitarian upstarts like Syriza in Greece and other movements elsewhere, and the ones who replace them, the ones who feed off the energy that the left was unable to harness, is the far right. The far right that's victorious in Hungary, that's on the rise in Greece, it's on the rise in France, and this is this.
Look, it's.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Socialism, it's once again, buddy, socialism or barbarism, right?